America has always been known for big V8 power and roaring muscle. But some of the fastest machines ever built here ended up forgotten with time. These weren't just quick, they were lightning on wheels, cars that could outrun almost anything in their day. Sleek designs, monstrous engines, and raw performance made them true legends, yet history buried them under the shadow of more famous names. Today, we're bringing them back with the 12 forgotten super fastest American cars. Hidden rockets, overlooked legends, and speed machines you won't believe ever existed. Stick around till the end, and don't forget to subscribe.
The 1969 AMC AMX 390 with the Go package is one of those rare moments when an underdog automaker swung far above its weight and shocked the automotive establishment. At a time when AMC was thought of primarily as the builder of family sedans, quirky compacts, and budget-friendly transport, the AMX came out of nowhere. A lean, two-seat, short-wheelbase muscle coupe that carried the heart of a Corvette, but wore a badge few had ever associated with raw speed. The 390 cubic inch V8 under its hood was no half-hearted attempt. With 315 horsepower and a mountain of torque, it made the AMX one of the quickest American performance cars of its era. Equipped with the Go package, which bundled in performance gearing, heavy-duty suspension, front disc brakes, dual exhausts, and special trim, the AMX became a true performance bargain that startled competitors and earned the respect of enthusiasts who dared to look beyond the Big Three. What made the AMX 390 so special wasn't just its engine, but the way AMC packaged it. Unlike most muscle cars of the day, which were based on mid-sized sedans and carried a curb weight to match, the AMX was stripped down to its essentials. Its wheelbase was just 97 inches, shorter than a Corvette's, and its body was compact, giving it sharp reflexes and a planted stance on the road. Drop the hammer and the AMX could blast from 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds, a figure that put it in rare company for 1969. Quarter-mile times dipped into the mid-14-second range, making it competitive with GTOs, Camaros, and even some big-block Chevelles. Yet the AMX wasn't just about straight-line speed. Its size and suspension tuning gave it an agility that heavier muscle cars couldn't match, earning it comparisons to European GTs as well as Detroit's best. The Go package was more than just a sticker or appearance upgrade. It was AMC's way of showing that it could build a serious performance machine. Buyers who checked the option box got a car that was truly track-ready, with better handling, stronger braking, and cosmetic touches like bold stripes and Magnum 500 wheels that made the AMX look every bit as mean as it was. In a sea of muscle cars that sometimes felt interchangeable, the AMX stood out as something unique, a two-seater American hot rod that wasn't trying to be a family car with a big motor, but a focused sports machine designed for enthusiasts. It's no wonder that even today, collectors who discover an original 390 Go package AMX feel like they've unearthed a piece of forgotten performance history. Culturally, the AMX carried a different kind of swagger than a Mustang or a Camaro. It didn't have the corporate backing or the mainstream advertising campaigns of the Big Three, but that worked in its favor. To own an AMX in 1969 was to send a message. You weren't just another guy following the crowd, you wanted something bolder, something different, something that shocked people when you told them who built it. Owners of the time often joked that it was a Corvette from the wrong side of the tracks, and the comparison wasn't far off. It had the same two-seat sports car proportions, nearly the same acceleration, and a unique personality that set it apart from the pack. It was raw, brash, and unpolished, but that only added to its charm. One longtime owner once said, "The AMX 390 was the kind of car that made you feel like you had a secret." People would laugh when I told them it was an AMC until they saw the tail end of it disappearing down the street. It had muscle, it had soul, and it never cared about being polite. Another reflected, "I had friends with Mustangs and Camaros, but my AMX felt alive in a way theirs didn't. It was unpredictable, short-tempered, and fast as hell. You didn't drive it so much as wrestle it, but that's what made it unforgettable." Today, the 1969 AMX 390 Go package stands as one of the most brilliant and underrated performance cars of its era. Its rarity,
Fewer than 20,000 AMXs of all trims were built between 1968 and 1970, with an even smaller number getting the 390 and Go package, makes it a true collectible. Yet its appeal goes far beyond numbers. It represents AMC at its boldest, when the company dared to step into the muscle car wars and prove that it could build something every bit as thrilling as the competition. For enthusiasts who value individuality and raw performance, the AMX 390 remains a shining reminder that sometimes the best muscle cars come from the least expected places. Would you like me to also expand on how the AMX 390 stacked up against the Corvette, Mustang, and Camaro of the same year to show just how impressive it really was? The 1971 Plymouth GTX 440 barrel is one of those cars that quietly lurks in the shadow of its flashier Mopar cousins, yet in truth, it was one of the purest expressions of muscle car engineering of its time. By 1971, the muscle car wars were beginning to shift. Insurance rates were climbing, emissions regulations were tightening, and the golden era was approaching its twilight. But Plymouth wasn't ready to let go. With the GTX, especially when equipped with the mighty 440 barrel, they built a machine that was equal parts refinement and savagery, a car that could carry you in comfort during the week and shred tires on the weekend. The 440 barrel setup was legendary in itself. Instead of a single massive carburetor, the engine breathed through 3 Holley 2-barrel carbs mounted in line, a system that provided both drivability and explosive performance. Under light throttle, the center carb handled business smoothly, but bury the pedal, and the 2 outer carbs snapped open, dumping in fuel and air like a tidal wave. The result was 385 horsepower on paper. Though those who owned and raced these cars swore that number was sandbagged by Chrysler for insurance purposes, the real figure was easily north of 400. With torque so immense, it felt like the car was trying to twist the pavement beneath it. Period testers recorded quarter-mile times in the high 13s to low 14s, making the GTX 6-barrel more than capable of humiliating not just rival muscle cars, but even expensive European exotics of the early 1970s. What made the GTX special, compared to its more famous stablemates like the Cuda or the Roadrunner, was its unique balance of luxury and muscle. Plymouth had marketed the GTX as the gentleman's hot rod. It came with plush interiors, available air conditioning, and a touch of class that wasn't always present in bare-bones muscle machines. Yet underneath that veneer of comfort lurked a brute force powerhouse. The 6-barrel engine didn't discriminate. Whether you were hauling the kids or prowling the drag strip, it was always ready to unleash violence at a moment's notice. This dual personality made it a car that appealed to buyers who wanted the muscle experience without sacrificing everyday civility. Visually, the 1971 GTX had a distinctive new look thanks to Chrysler's fuselage styling. The lines were smooth, muscular, and more aerodynamic than the blockier late 60s designs. Wide, aggressive haunches and a split grille gave it a presence that announced business without needing flamboyant stripes or wings. For those who knew what a 446 BBL fender badge meant, however, it was a warning. This wasn't just another pretty Plymouth. It was a torque monster in disguise. Owners from back in the day often recalled just how deceptive the GTX was. One enthusiast remembered, "People thought of the GTX as the rich man's Roadrunner, a cruiser for guys who didn't really want to race. But if you had the 6-barrel, that car was a beast. I lined up against a Corvette once and left him looking like he was standing still." Another owner said, "It was the kind of car you could drive to dinner with your wife looking respectable, but the moment you dropped the hammer, it was like unleashing a wild animal. It had class, but it was never tame." The GTX 6-barrel also held its own in the Mopar family. While the Hemi grabbed headlines with its exotic racing pedigree, it was expensive and finicky on the street. The 446 barrel, on the other hand, was more affordable, easier to maintain, and often quicker in real-world conditions thanks to its tidal wave of torque. Many seasoned drag racers of the era preferred the 6-barrel because it delivered consistent performance without the delicate tuning that the Hemi required. In fact, in the early 1970s, some considered the 446 barrel to be the ultimate street engine Chrysler offered, fierce, reliable, and brutally effective.
Today, the 1971 Plymouth GTX 446 barrel is an overlooked jewel. Collectors chase Hemi Cudas or Superbirds, leaving the GTX to sit in the shadows, which is ironic because it represents the muscle car formula in one of its purest forms. It combined the everyday livability that muscle cars often lacked with an engine setup that could turn the world sideways with a tap of the throttle. It was subtle compared to its winged or striped Mopar siblings, but that subtlety is what makes it so brilliant. It was the muscle car that didn't need to shout. It just did the job, and it did it devastatingly well. Would you like me to also expand on how the GTX 6-barrel compared head-to-head with the 426 Hemi, and why many old-school racers quietly considered it the smarter buy?
The 1963 Studebaker Avanti R3 Supercharged is one of those astonishing, almost mythical cars that seems too good to be true, and yet it was. By the early 1960s, Studebaker was struggling financially, its survival hinging on bold moves that might capture the public's imagination. Enter the Avanti, Raymond Loewy's sleek, futuristic, fiberglass-bodied coupe, pitched as America's answer to the European GT. But while the base Avanti was stylish, it was the ultra-rare R3 version, developed by Andy Granatelli and his brothers at Paxton Products, that turned this elegant car into a record-breaking missile. The R3 was Studebaker's ultimate factory hot rod. At its heart was a bored-out 304.5 cubic-inch version of the company's 289 V8, hand-built to racing specifications. With forged internals, hot camshaft, and carefully massaged heads, the R3 was already stout, but then they topped it with a Paxton centrifugal supercharger. The result was a conservatively rated 335 horsepower, though insiders claimed the real number was closer to 400. In a car that weighed just over 3,000 pounds, the R3 gave the Avanti performance that put it into rare company indeed. The car's true brilliance was proven at the Bonneville Salt Flats in 1963, when Studebaker set out to demonstrate just what the Avanti could do. Factory-prepared Avantis, including the R3, shattered records left and right, ultimately setting 29 official national speed records. Among the most jaw-dropping was an R3 that topped 170 miles per hour on the salt, faster than a Ferrari 250 GT Berlinetta or a Jaguar E-Type could dream of at the time. This was a Studebaker, a brand thought of as conservative and almost old-fashioned, suddenly standing toe-to-toe with the finest sports cars in the world, and winning. The Avanti's styling also deserves mention because it looked like nothing else on American roads in 1963. Loewy's team sculpted a body with clean lines, a grille-less nose, a Coke bottle waistline, and an aerodynamic flow that made Detroit's other offerings look like dinosaurs. The R3 version didn't scream muscle with stripes or scoops. It was subtle, almost understated, but underneath its smooth shell was a car that could dust just about anything at a stoplight. The Avanti's design was so ahead of its time that it would be copied, revived, and imitated for decades after Studebaker's collapse. For those lucky enough to drive one, the R3 left lasting impressions. One owner recalled, "You'd pull up next to a Corvette and they'd smirk at the Studebaker badge. But once that blower whined and the tires broke loose, their faces told the story. Shock, disbelief, and then nothing but taillights." Another said, "It wasn't just fast in a straight line. The Avanti felt planted at 120, 130 miles per hour, stable in a way that most American cars of the time weren't. It was built to fly, and that stability wasn't by accident. Studebaker engineers had tested the Avanti's aerodynamics extensively, and its smooth fiberglass skin gave it an edge over the brick-shaped muscle cars that would follow. What makes the R3 Avanti so fascinating is its sheer rarity. Only about 9 true factory R3 Avantis were ever built, making it one of the rarest American performance cars of the 1960s. Studebaker's financial woes meant that even as the Avanti was proving itself on the salt flats, the company didn't have the resources to properly market or mass produce it. By 1966, Studebaker was gone, and the Avanti, despite its brilliance, was already fading into obscurity. Today, the R3 Avanti is a ghost story in the muscle and performance car world. Collectors chase Hemi Mopars, Shelbys, and big block Chevelles, while the Studebaker sits forgotten, despite having humiliated European exotics and written its name into the Bonneville record books. And that's the tragedy. The R3 Avanti proved that Studebaker, given the right tools, could have been a world-class performance brand. Instead, it became a footnote, its greatest achievement remembered only by enthusiasts and historians. In many ways, the 1963 Avanti R3 Supercharged was America's first true supercar, a blend of exotic styling, advanced aerodynamics, brutal forced induction power, and record-setting speed. It was faster than the Ferraris and Jaguars of its day, built by a company fighting for survival, and produced in such tiny numbers that each surviving example is practically priceless. Forgotten now, yes, but in its moment, it was a monster that should have rewritten automotive history. Would you like me to also dive into how the R3 compared with the Corvette Stingray of the same year, and why it could have completely changed the balance of American performance if Studebaker had survived? The 1971 Ford Torino Cobra 429 Super Cobra jet is one of those brutally underrated machines that lived in the shadow of Ford's golden child, the Mustang, but in reality carried more muscle, more menace, and far more raw capability than most people realize. Where the Mustang was the flashy pony car designed to capture attention and style-conscious buyers, the Torino Cobra in 429 SCJ form was something else entirely. A pure muscle car built with drag racing in mind, stripped of pretense and loaded with firepower. It wasn't about image, it was about domination. The heart of the Torino Cobra SCJ was, of course, the 429 cubic inch Super Cobra Jet V8. This wasn't some mild performance package dressed up with decals. It was a true street brawler, engineered with drag racing in mind. The SCJ option added 4-bolt mains, a beefy nodular iron crankshaft, forged pistons, a solid lifter camshaft, and a serious Holy carburetor feeding air into a high-rise aluminum intake. Ford rated it at 375 horsepower, but in reality, dyno numbers proved it was well above that, often closer to 450 horses, with torque figures so immense that the rear tires cried for mercy the moment you touched the throttle. But the brilliance of the SCJ package wasn't just under the hood. When you checked the box for the Torino Cobra with the drag pack, you got 3.91 or 4.11 gears, an engine oil cooler, and beefed-up internals designed to handle full throttle abuse. What this meant was that the Torino Cobra SCJ was essentially a factory-built drag car you could drive off the showroom floor, bolt slicks onto, and run 13-second quarter miles right out of the box. Numbers that embarrassed many Mopars and even some big block Chevys of the day. Stylistically, the 1971 Torino was one of Ford's most aggressive designs. The Coke bottle shape, long hood, short deck proportions, and semi-fastback roofline gave the Cobra a menacing stance. The ram air hood with its twin scoops feeding cold air directly into that 429 was as functional as it was intimidating. On the street, it looked like a predator crouched and ready to strike, and in a sense, that's exactly what it was. Where a Mustang Mach-1 might have attracted a wider audience with its flash, the Torino Cobra SCJ was darker, angrier, and aimed at a more hardcore buyer. Owners who had them back in the day remembered them with a mixture of awe and fear. One drag racer recalled, "The 429 SCJ didn't want to cruise, it wanted to hunt. You couldn't just loaf around town in it because every tap of the throttle reminded you the car was built to kill tires. If you didn't respect it, it would bite." Another enthusiast said, "It was like Ford quietly slipped us a factory drag car. People lined up against Hemis, 454 Chevelles, you name it, and the Torino could hang with any of them. Most folks didn't even see it coming because everyone was watching the Mustangs." And that's part of why the Torino Cobra SCJ has slipped into obscurity. The Mustang hogged the spotlight, the Boss 429 soaked up the halo status, and the Torino was quietly left to be discovered by drag racers and serious enthusiasts who knew what it really was. Sadly, very few survived. Many of these cars were bought by young men who treated them like disposable drag strip weapons, running them hard until they blew, stripped them for parts, or watched them rust away in backyards. Unlike Mustangs, which were pampered as collector's items, the Torino Cobra SCJ was used exactly for what it was built for. And that's why finding an intact, numbers-matching example today is almost impossible. Looking back, the 1971 Torino Cobra 429 SCJ represents Ford at its most honest and aggressive. No gimmicks, no fancy badges to chase Camaro sales, just a big, angry, barely street-legal weapon built for straight-line performance. It was a car that didn't compromise, didn't apologize, and didn't care about polish. In many ways, it was the true spirit of American muscle distilled into a single machine. While collectors and casual fans will always chase Boss Mustangs and Shelby Mustangs, those in the know understand that the Torino Cobra SCJ was Ford's real heavyweight brawler of the early 70s. If you parked one next to a 71 Hemi Charger or an LS6 Chevelle, it wouldn't be the flashiest car in the lineup, but when the light turned green, it could stand shoulder to shoulder with either of them. A factory-built street racer, yes, but also one of the most brutally honest muscle cars ever to roll out of Detroit. Do you want me to also expand on how the Torino Cobra SCJ stacked up against the Mopar 446-pack cars and the LS6 Chevelle in real-world drag racing back then?
The 1969 Chevrolet Kingswood Wagon 427 is one of those magical contradictions that only Detroit in the late 1960s could have created. On the surface, it looked like the ultimate family hauler, a full-size station wagon complete with acres of sheet metal, endless chrome, and of course, the requisite wood grain panels stretching down its flanks. It was the car suburban families used for grocery runs, cross-country vacations, and Saturday baseball games. But under the hood, when properly optioned, lurked a beast that absolutely did not belong in something as practical and unassuming as a Kingswood. With the big block 427 cubic inch V8 shoehorned between the fenders, this wagon became something truly absurd and truly wonderful, a family bus that could embarrass sports cars at a stoplight. The 427, in its most common form for full-size Chevrolets, was offered in several power levels, ranging from around 335 horsepower to well over 390 horses, depending on the configuration. And while the lighter Chevelle SS and Camaro Z28 made headlines with their muscle credentials, the Kingswood 427 quietly sat in the background, offering the same power in a package that could haul 7 passengers and their luggage with ease. It was essentially the definition of a sleeper car, a car that outwardly promised nothing more than suburban practicality, but secretly had the heart of a street racer. Performance was shockingly good for something tipping the scales at over 4,500 pounds. Period tests and owner recollections put the 0 to 60 mile/hour time at just over 7 seconds, which was downright startling for a wagon of its size. Quarter miles in the mid-15-second range were achievable with nothing more than a heavy right foot, making the Kingswood 427 a car that could, in theory, drop the kids off at school in the morning and then go chase GTOs and roadrunners in the evening. Its massive torque output also meant it could tow boats or trailers without breaking a sweat, making it one of the rare vehicles that truly blended muscle with practicality. One of the most charming aspects of the Kingswood Wagon 427 is how invisible it was. Unlike a Chevelle SS 396 with stripes or a Camaro RS SS with hideaway headlights, the Kingswood looked plain, almost dowdy. Sure, it had a long roofline and plenty of chrome, but it never screamed performance. That's what made it so effective as a stoplight assassin. One former owner once reminisced, "Nobody ever expected a big family wagon to move like that. You'd pull up next to some guy in a Firebird and he'd laugh.
Then the light would turn green and you'd see his jaw drop in the rearview mirror as the wagon thundered ahead. But because wagons were considered disposable family cars, almost none of these big block Kingswoods were preserved. They were bought new by fathers who wanted one car that could do it all: haul the kids, tow the camper, and maybe have a little fun on the weekends. Few people considered them collectible at the time, and when gas prices climbed and emissions strangled performance in the mid-1970s, most were sold off cheaply or left to rot. Today, a genuine Kingswood wagon with a factory 427 is almost impossible to find. Many were stripped of their big block engines long ago, the motors transplanted into Camaros, Corvettes, or drag cars, while the wagons themselves were sent to the crusher. And yet, looking back, the Kingswood 427 feels like a car ahead of its time. In an era where sleeper wagons like the Mercedes E63 AMG or Audi RS6 Avant are celebrated as the ultimate blend of family practicality and supercar performance, the Kingswood Wagon 427 was doing it decades earlier, and in a much more unassuming way. It was the original muscle wagon, proof that Chevrolet wasn't afraid to put its biggest and baddest engines into just about anything. The 1969 Kingswood Wagon 427 is a reminder of how wonderfully eccentric American car culture used to be. It's forgotten today, not because it wasn't good, but because it was too far outside the spotlight, overshadowed by Chevelles, Camaros, and Novas. But for those who owned one, or for the lucky few who stumble across one today, it represents a kind of perfection: fast, practical, tough, and completely unexpected. It was the ultimate family hot rod, hiding in plain sight on suburban streets, waiting to shock the unprepared. Would you like me to expand further on how the Kingswood Wagon 427 compared to Mopar's big block wagons of the same era, like the Dodge Coronet or Plymouth Satellite wagons, which also offered serious muscle hidden in family bodies?
The 1974 Pontiac GTO 400 is one of the most misunderstood and unfairly forgotten machines of the muscle car era's twilight years. By 1974, the golden age of raw horsepower was in retreat. Rising insurance premiums, stricter emissions regulations, and the looming fuel crisis were cutting the legs out from under every performance car in America. The great muscle machines of just a few years earlier, the Hemi Cuda, the LS6 Chevelle, the Judge, were being strangled into shadows of their former selves. And yet, Pontiac, the brand that had practically invented the muscle car with the original GTO a decade earlier, refused to let the torch die quietly. Instead, they offered one last small-body GTO fitted with the 400 cubic inch V8, a car that managed to capture a surprising amount of the old spirit in a very different automotive world. On paper, the 1974 GTO was already a controversial beast. For the first time, the GTO wasn't its own standalone model or based on the mid-sized Le Mans. Instead, it was dropped into the compact Pontiac Ventura lineup, essentially Pontiac's version of the Chevy Nova. To purists, this was blasphemy. The GTO was supposed to be big, brash, and imposing, not based on an economy car platform, but Pontiac engineers knew what they were doing. By shedding weight and moving to a smaller chassis, the GTO regained a kind of nimbleness and everyday usability that many of the bloated mid-size muscle cars of the early 70s had lost. The heart of the car was still worthy of the badge. A 400 cubic inch V8 rated at 200 net horsepower, which was closer to 260 to 280 in gross terms, paired with either a 4-speed manual or an automatic. In an era where most muscle machines were being choked down to 150 horsepower or less, the 1974 GTO's engine gave it a real edge. It could hustle down the quarter mile in the mid-15-second range and 0 to 60 in around 7.5 seconds, which was very respectable for its time. Contemporary road tests noted that it was one of the very few cars in 1974 that still felt legitimately quick, especially when ordered with the 4-speed and 3.42 gears. But numbers only tell part of the story. The Ventura-based GTO handled better than its predecessors thanks to its lighter weight and smaller footprint.
Owners often recall how tossable and agile it felt compared to the heavier 71 to 73 GTOs. One enthusiast later wrote, "It wasn't the brawler the old GTOs were, but it felt sharper, tighter, and easier to drive fast. In a weird way, it was more fun day to day." This gave the 74 GTO a dual personality. It could still light up its rear tires and make muscle car music when pushed, but it was also a car you could commute in without feeling like you were driving a dinosaur. Styling was another hot debate. The 74 GTO had unique stripes, a shaker hood scoop, and Pontiac's signature Endura nose treatment, giving it a tough, youthful look. Some dismissed it as looking too much like a dressed-up Nova, but others appreciated its leaner, meaner appearance compared to the bloated intermediates of the time. It was Pontiac trying to bring the GTO back to its roots, a smaller, affordable, performance-focused car built for the everyman. Of course, timing was the GTO's biggest enemy. 1974 was the first year of federally mandated 5-mile-per-hour crash bumpers, and the big chrome beams stuck onto the GTO's nose and tail didn't do its styling any favors. Worse still, the oil crisis hit hard in late 1973, and buyers were flocking to Pintos, Corollas, and VW Beetles instead of performance cars. Pontiac sold just over 7,000 GTOs in 1974, a fraction of the glory days when the badge moved over 70,000 units a year. And with that, the original GTO era came to an end, leaving the 74 model as both the last of the line and one of the most misunderstood. Today, the 1974 GTO 400 is rarely celebrated, even among muscle car circles. Collectors chase the 64 to 70 models, and even the early 70s big-body GTOs get more love. But if you look at it honestly, the 74 stands as one of the most underrated performance bargains of its day. It was quick, sharp handling, stylish in its own way, and far more practical than the fire-breathing brutes that came before it. In many respects, it was Pontiac's way of trying to future-proof the muscle car formula, shrinking it down to something that could survive the new realities of the 1970s. Sadly, the market wasn't ready for it. And yet, for those who know, the 1974 Pontiac GTO 400 is a hidden gem. It's the car that proved Pontiac's spirit hadn't died yet, even when the world was turning against muscle cars. One former owner summed it up perfectly. "People laughed when I told them it was a 74 GTO. Then I'd take them for a ride, and they stopped laughing real quick. It was the last gasp of the real GTO, and it went out swinging." Would you like me to write a dramatic comparison of the 74 GTO 400 against its rivals from the same year, like the Dodge Dart Sport 360 or Chevy Nova SS, to show just how strong it actually was in its era?
The 1964 Dodge Polara 426 Max Wedge is one of those cars that feels like a half-forgotten legend, overshadowed by the fame of the 426 Hemi that came just a year later, but in its time, it was the absolute king of the drag strip. When people today think of Mopar muscle, they picture Chargers, Super Bs, or Cudas with Hemis under the hood. But before the Elephant motor arrived, Dodge and Plymouth already had a fearsome reputation thanks to the Max Wedge program. These were engines built specifically for one purpose: to dominate quarter-mile competition. And the 1964 Dodge Polara, equipped with a 426 Max Wedge, was one of the deadliest street-legal weapons you could buy at a dealership in the entire country. The Max Wedge name referred to Chrysler's line of high-performance big-block V8s that debuted in 1962 and were fine-tuned for drag racing over the next few years. By 1964, the displacement had reached 426 cubic inches, and Dodge offered it in two versions: the Stage 3 415 horsepower version and an even hotter 425 horsepower unit. These numbers were official ratings, but anyone who ran one of these cars knew the engines were underrated. Real output was closer to 470-480 horsepower, depending on tune and gearing. Everything about the 426 Max Wedge was engineered for maximum thrust in a straight line. It had enormous cylinder heads with raised intake ports and massive valves to maximize breathing. The compression ratios were sky-high, 12.5 to 1 in some setups, which meant you had to run on racing fuel or at least premium gas blended with additives. The cross-ram intake manifold was one of its most distinctive features, with two 4-barrel carburetors mounted diagonally on top of the engine, feeding cylinders through long runners designed to boost high RPM horsepower. When you popped the hood, it looked like nothing else on the street. The sound, too, was otherworldly, a deep, ragged, almost violent roar that shook windows when you opened it up. The Polara itself was a full-size Dodge, and in 1964 it was still fairly light for its size. Dodge kept the car stripped down for performance, with bench seats, basic interiors, and minimal trim if you ordered them for racing. Many Max Wedge buyers skipped radios and heaters altogether to shave off pounds. With these weight-saving tricks and the monstrous torque of the 426, these cars were capable of low 13-second or even high 12-second quarter-mile times right off the showroom floor, a staggering achievement in 1964. To put that into perspective, the only production cars faster were extremely rare European exotics like Ferraris or Maseratis, and they cost several times more. A Polara Max Wedge was a giant killer, taking average working-class buyers into performance territory usually reserved for the wealthy elite. But make no mistake, these weren't comfortable daily drivers. The high compression made them temperamental, especially on pump gas. They idled rough, they overheated in traffic, and their drivability was questionable in anything other than straight-line sprints. Dodge knew exactly what these cars were for. They were factory-built drag racers, thinly disguised as street machines. Dealers often warned buyers that if they planned to actually drive them on the road every day, they'd be in for a rude awakening. The arrival of the 426 Hemi in 1966 stole much of the spotlight from the Max Wedge cars, and that's why the '64 Polara Max Wedge is less remembered today. But among hardcore Mopar enthusiasts, it remains one of the most important stepping stones in muscle car history. Without the Max Wedge program, the Hemi might never have reached its legendary status. These cars proved that Chrysler could not just build big engines, but incredibly advanced, purpose-built drag strip dominators that embarrassed the competition. One owner who restored his Polara Max Wedge years later put it best. It wasn't a car you cruised on Saturday night with the radio on. It was a weapon. At every stoplight, it wanted to fight. You could feel the car vibrating like it was itching for the green. It scared people, and that's exactly what Dodge wanted. The 1964 Dodge Polara 426 Max Wedge is not just a car, it's one of the last pure, unfiltered expressions of early muscle car insanity before the Hemi era began. Brutal, raw, unforgiving, and devastatingly quick, it deserves far more recognition than it gets today as one of the first true street-legal race cars built in America. Would you like me to write about the direct rivalry between the 426 Max Wedge Polara and Ford's 427 Galaxy Lightweight from the same era, showing how the two brands fought tooth and nail on the strip?
The 1978 Chevrolet Corvette L82 is one of those cars that gets overlooked today, mostly because people still picture the late 1970s as the dark ages of performance. And in many ways, they were. Engines were strangled by emissions equipment, horsepower ratings plunged compared to just a few years earlier, and big blocks were essentially gone. But in that bleak environment, the Corvette, especially in its L82 form, stood tall as a survivor of the muscle era. In fact, in 1978, the Corvette L82 was not just a survivor, it was a standout. A car that could still deliver genuinely quick acceleration when almost every other performance machine had been neutered. The L82 package was Chevrolet's higher performance small block option, a tuned version of the venerable 350 cubic inch V8. While the base Corvette made just 185 horsepower, the L82 bumped that figure to a then impressive 220. That number may sound tame today, but context is everything. In 1978, the Pontiac Trans Am 400 made about 180 horses, the Ford Mustang II Cobra II barely cracked 140, and even most mid-sized muscle cars were languishing in the 160 to 170 range. Against this backdrop, 220 horsepower suddenly looked like a miracle. For enthusiasts who wanted a real performance car in 1978, the Corvette L82 was one of the only genuine options left on the American market. And performance numbers backed it up. Period tests clocked the L82 Corvette at 0 to 60 in around 6.8 to 7.2 seconds, depending on gearing and tires, and the quarter mile in the mid-15s. That may not sound earth-shattering today, but in 1978, those numbers made it one of the quickest American cars on the road, faster than almost everything else Detroit was building, and capable of keeping up with many European sports cars that cost considerably more. Drivers of Camaros, Firebirds, and Mustangs quickly learned that if they pulled up next to an L82 Corvette, they were going to be staring at its tailpipes when the light turned green. But it wasn't just straight-line speed that made the 1978 Corvette special. That year marked the car's 25th anniversary, and Chevrolet celebrated with a fresh redesign of the body. The new fastback rear window gave the Corvette a sleeker, more modern profile, while also improving visibility and luggage space. Inside, the car got a cleaner, more refined interior that finally felt closer to a luxury GT than the stripped-down muscle cars of the early 70s. Buyers could even choose the new Silver Anniversary two-tone paint scheme, which has since become one of the most iconic Corvette looks of the era. The L82 option itself included more than just horsepower. It came with a higher 9-to-1 compression ratio, larger valves, a hotter camshaft, a dual snorkel air cleaner, and a freer flowing exhaust. Mated to either a close ratio 4-speed manual or an automatic, it gave the Corvette a level of urgency and responsiveness that the base model just didn't have. Owners often remarked that the L82 felt alive in a way the standard 350 didn't. You could really feel the difference the first time you buried your right foot into the carpet. Of course, the Corvette still carried some of the quirks of the late 70s. Build quality was inconsistent, the smog-era tuning made idle roughness and heat-soak common, and while the car was fast in a straight line, its handling was more about long, sweeping curves than sharp, nimble moves. But none of that mattered to buyers who wanted one thing above all else: a car that still felt like a true sports machine when the rest of Detroit was building underpowered, vinyl-roofed land yachts. One owner who bought an L82 brand new in 1978 later recalled, "People laughed at Corvettes back then, said they weren't what they used to be. But I lined up against a 400 Trans Am and left him behind. Easy." That shut them up quick. It wasn't a 70 LS6 Chevelle, but it was the only new car that gave you that same thrill. Today, the 1978 Corvette L82 occupies a fascinating niche. It's not as coveted as the chrome bumper Corvettes of the late 60s, nor as wild as the high-horsepower big blocks. But it represents something just as important: the car that kept the flame of American performance alive when everything else was dimming. In a world where speed had nearly vanished, the L82 Corvette gave enthusiasts hope that the muscle car spirit wasn't gone forever. Would you like me to also expand on how the 1978 Corvette L82 compared directly to its European rivals, like the Porsche 911 SC and the Jaguar XJS, to show just how impressive it really was for its time?
The 1966 Oldsmobile Tornado 425 is one of those cars that seems impossible at first glance. A massive, front-wheel drive luxury coupe packing a 425 cubic inch V8 under a long, sweeping hood. To the casual observer, it looked like a stately cruiser meant for gliding down boulevards in comfort, not a car capable of shaking the pavement under its tires. But Oldsmobile engineers had other ideas.
The Tornado 425 wasn't just a statement in style, it was a statement in engineering audacity, a performance car disguised as a luxury limousine for two. Under the Tornado's sleek, candy apple-painted hood lay the massive 425 cubic inch V8, producing over 380 horsepower and a staggering 475 pound-feet of torque. For 1966, that kind of power was enough to make many mid-sized muscle cars jealous. Yet the Tornado carried nearly 4,500 pounds of luxury and still managed to surprise drivers and onlookers alike. What made it even more remarkable was that this power was delivered to the front wheels, a layout almost unheard of for American V8s at the time. Oldsmobile's innovative, unitized power package integrated a chain-driven torque converter and a two-speed automatic transmission into a compact housing that sent all that muscle to the front tires without the need for a driveshaft tunnel. It was a technological marvel, smooth, reliable, and incredibly effective. Performance numbers for the Tornado 425 were genuinely impressive. With over 380 horsepower at its disposal, the car could sprint to 60 miles per hour in under 7 seconds, a figure that put it on par with many smaller, lighter muscle cars of the era. Quarter-mile times were in the low 15s, an astonishing feat for a car of its size and weight. Drivers often remarked on the car's straight-line stability and the effortless surge of torque that seemed to push the car forward without breaking a sweat. For a front-wheel drive car this large, it was essentially a highway rocket, merging the comfort of a luxury coupe with the exhilaration of a muscle car. Styling was another area where the Tornado dazzled. Its long hood, short deck proportions, and hidden headlights gave it a futuristic, almost European appearance. The design was low and wide, with smooth lines that accentuated the car's aggressive stance. Inside, the cabin was plush and luxurious, featuring bucket seats, thick carpeting, and a center console-mounted shifter that added a sporty touch to an otherwise elegant interior. It looked like a car built for executives in high society, yet underneath, it hid a brute capable of surprising anyone who dared to challenge it at a stoplight. The Tornado 425 was more than just an exercise in performance. It was a statement of engineering bravado. Most American manufacturers stuck with conventional rear-wheel drive layouts, fearing that front-wheel drive couldn't handle big V8s. Oldsmobile proved them wrong. By eliminating the drive shaft, the Tornado offered a flat floor, better interior space, and unique weight distribution that enhanced traction off the line. The car was surprisingly well balanced, with the front wheels gripping firmly under hard acceleration, allowing it to launch smoothly without the wheel hop or torque steer that plagued many early FWD designs. Owners who experienced the Tornado often describe it as a revelation. One recalled, "You'd sit there in traffic, and people would think you're in a slow luxury car. Then you hit the gas, and suddenly you're laughing at all the Mustangs and Chevelles that thought they could beat you. They never saw it coming because it didn't look like a muscle car. It was the perfect disguise." Another enthusiast mentioned that long highway cruises were a dream, with the engine's torque allowing effortless passing at high speeds, making the Tornado feel more like a grand tour than a conventional muscle car. Despite its brilliance, the Tornado has been somewhat forgotten in muscle car lore, overshadowed by the traditional rear-wheel drive stars of the 1960s. Few people realized that a front-wheel drive luxury coupe could combine style, comfort, and genuine performance in such a radical way. Today, surviving examples are rare, and collectors treasure them for both their technological innovation and their ability to surprise anyone who underestimates them. The 1966 Oldsmobile Tornado 425 is a reminder that American muscle wasn't just about brute force and raucous styling. It could also be about innovation, audacity, and clever engineering. A front-wheel drive luxury coupe that could blow past a Corvette or Chevelle at the drag strip? That's not just muscle, that's genius hiding in plain sight. If you want, I can also write a comparison of the Tornado 425's performance and innovation against contemporaries like the Cadillac Eldorado and Buick Riviera, showing why it was a true leader in the FWD luxury coupe category. The 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 429CJ is one of those rare gems of the muscle car era that exists in a curious space between obscurity and legend. To most casual enthusiasts, Mercury was a brand caught in the middle, not quite the mass-market Ford, not quite the premium Lincoln, and often overlooked in discussions of iconic muscle cars. Yet in 1970, Mercury quietly produced one of the most aggressive, fastest, and technically impressive muscle cars on the planet, the Cyclone spoiler fitted with the 429 Cobra Jet Big Block. It was a car designed to perform like a rocket, look like a thoroughbred, and intimidate anyone foolish enough to line up at a drag strip against it. But it did so under the radar of mainstream attention. Its rarity and subtlety make it a fascinating study in how great engineering can be overlooked when marketing doesn't follow suit. The heart of the Cyclone spoiler 429CJ was the 429 Cobra Jet, an engine that Ford had developed in secret for serious performance applications including NASCAR. Rated conservatively at 370 horsepower, the reality of the engine's output was much higher, especially with the optional Ram Air induction package or a slight tune. The engine delivered monstrous torque, enough to throw the car forward with the force of a freight train. The two-barrel induction system was standard, but many enthusiasts added the four-barrel intake or factory Ram Air setup, which transformed the car into a straight-line terror. Launching from a stoplight, the 429CJ Cyclone could easily embarrass a Chevelle SS454, a Plymouth Roadrunner 440, or even a Dodge Charger RT 440. What made it even shocking was that this was a Mercury, a brand perceived as more reserved and subtle compared to the brash Mopars and Chevys. The Cyclone spoiler itself was visually stunning yet functional. Its lowered front end, fiberglass hood, functional scoops, and optional rear spoiler weren't just for show. They improved aerodynamics and helped keep the front tires planted at high speed. This was a car designed with NASCAR in mind. The chassis had reinforced suspension, heavier sway bars, and optional traction bars that allowed the massive torque to be transmitted to the road without excessive wheel hop. It wasn't just fast in the straight line, it was predictable and stable, even when pushed hard at speed. Contemporary period tests placed it in the low 6-second range to 60 miles per hour and mid-13s in the quarter mile. Numbers that were exceptional for 1970, especially for a car that could also seat 4 passengers comfortably. Inside, the Cyclone spoiler maintained Mercury's focus on refinement. Unlike many muscle cars that sacrifice comfort for performance, the Cyclone offered a spacious interior, supportive bucket seats, optional console shifter, and well-crafted trim. It was a car you could drive every day, take on a weekend road trip, and still scare the pants off anyone lining up next to you at a stoplight. The combination of comfort, speed, and presence made it one of the most balanced muscle cars of its time, an understated brute that blended power and polish in a way few other cars could. Part of the car's mystique comes from its rarity. Mercury produced far fewer Cyclone spoilers than its Mopar or Chevy counterparts, and the 429 Cobra Jet option was even more limited. Many were purchased by racing enthusiasts or drag strip regulars who didn't care about originality, leading to numerous surviving cars being modified, repowered, or wrecked. Finding a numbers-matching example today is exceedingly rare, which only adds to the aura surrounding the model. Collectors who understand its performance potential are willing to pay handsomely, but the Cyclone has never received the kind of attention and respect afforded to Chevelles, Camaros, or Mopar muscle cars of the same era. The Cyclone spoiler 429CJ also tells a story about Mercury as a brand that was willing to take risks. At a time when Ford was experimenting with both marketing and engineering to compete with GM and Mopar, Mercury quietly produced a car that could match, and in some cases outperform, the most legendary muscle machines of the day. It didn't need flashy commercials, big dealer campaigns, or national fanfare. It let the car speak for itself on the strip. The surprise factor was part of its charm. A driver could line up next to a Dodge Charger, a Chevelle, or a Roadrunner, and few competitors would realize what they were in for until the green light dropped.
Owners who experience the Cyclone spoiler firsthand often describe it as a car that demanded respect. One veteran enthusiast recalled, "You could drive it like a normal Mercury, no one would blink, and then you'd bury the throttle and leave everyone behind. It was like a wolf in sheep's clothing." People underestimated it because of the badge, and that was exactly the point. Another wrote that the car's combination of raw power, stability, and comfort made it one of the most enjoyable muscle cars to drive on long stretches of highway, not just at the drag strip. Ultimately, the 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 429CJ represents a fascinating intersection of rarity, performance, and design audacity. It was Mercury's ultimate muscle machine, capable of standing toe-to-toe with more famous contemporaries, yet largely forgotten by history due to brand perception and limited production. Today, enthusiasts who uncover a clean, original example are looking at a car that embodies the very essence of the early 1970s muscle ethos: raw power, aggressive styling, and an uncompromising desire to perform, all wrapped in a subtle, understated Mercury shell. If you want, I can also create a detailed head-to-head comparison between the 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 429CJ and its fiercest contemporaries, the Dodge Charger Daytona 440, Plymouth Roadrunner 440, and Chevrolet SS 454, to show exactly how Mercury's underdog muscle car measured up.
The 1965 Buick Riviera Grand Sport 425 Nailhead is one of those rare cars that perfectly blends elegance and raw power, earning it the nickname a gentleman's dragster from those lucky enough to own one. At first glance, the Riviera GS looks like a luxury coupe, with sweeping lines, a long hood, and a poised, almost European stance that sets it apart from the more overtly aggressive muscle cars of the mid-60s. But beneath that refined exterior lurked a serious performance machine. Buick engineers equipped the Riviera GS with the legendary 425 cubic inch Nailhead V8, a power plant already famous for its torque and low-end punch, and then added a dual quad carb setup that pushed output to an impressive 360 horsepower. What made the Riviera GS special wasn't just the power. Almost every muscle car of the era could claim big numbers, but the way that power was delivered. The Nailhead engine had a unique vertical valve arrangement that allowed it to generate enormous torque at low RPMs. Combined with Buick's refined Dynaflow automatic, or the optional 4-speed manual, the Riviera could accelerate with surprising smoothness. A light touch of the accelerator would send the car surging forward with a quiet, almost effortless authority. It didn't roar like a Mopar or a Chevy Big Block. It glided and then hit you like a freight train. Owners of the era often described it as an almost stealthy form of performance. The car looked composed, but it could embarrass much sportier-looking machines in a straight line. The Riviera GS wasn't just about the engine. Buick carefully balanced ride comfort and performance, crafting a chassis and suspension that allowed the car to maintain poise at high speeds. Independent front suspension, a well-tuned rear leaf setup, and meticulous attention to weight distribution meant that this was a car that could handle long stretches of highway with grace, while still being able to launch off the line like a true muscle car when desired. This balance of comfort and performance is part of what earned it the gentleman's dragster moniker. Few cars could combine refined cruising and drag strip capability so seamlessly. Styling also set the Riviera GS apart. Its long, low profile and rakish roofline gave it a European flair, unusual for American muscle cars of the time. The GS package added subtle cues to distinguish it from the standard Riviera, including special badging, upgraded wheels, and interior touches like bucket seats and a center console. Unlike many muscle cars that screamed, "Look at me," the Riviera GS was understated, elegant, and confident in its presence, a car that let its performance speak quietly but decisively. Performance figures back up the reputation. 0 to 60 times hovered in the 6.5 to 7 second range, and quarter-mile runs could dip into the mid-14s with the right setup, a remarkable feat for a full-size luxury coupe. Its smooth delivery meant the car didn't feel like a brutal dragster. It felt like an accomplished athlete, a machine built to perform without showing its work. This combination of refinement, speed, and torque made it one of the most versatile and enjoyable muscle cars of its day. Collectors and enthusiasts today appreciate the Riviera GS for precisely these reasons. It wasn't a car built purely for show or street domination. It was a refined, capable, and rare performance machine that proved Buick could compete with Chevrolet, Pontiac, and even some Mopar offerings without abandoning elegance. Surviving examples are rare, and numbers-matching cars with the dual-quad 425 are highly sought after because they embody an era when American manufacturers were experimenting with the intersection of luxury, style, and muscle performance. One owner recalled, "You'd roll up to a light next to a Chevelle or a GTO, and they'd be revving and growling. I'd just ease into it, smooth as silk, and suddenly I was gone. They never saw it coming, and I never had to sacrifice comfort to win." That quiet, confident performance is exactly what made the Riviera Grand Sport 425 unique. The 1965 Buick Riviera GS 425 Nailhead remains a brilliant, underappreciated blend of speed, sophistication, and subtle muscle. A car for those who wanted authority on the road without resorting to shouting, chrome, and wild graphics. Few cars have matched that combination of grace and power, which is why it still turns heads among collectors and aficionados who understand what true understated American muscle feels like. If you want, I can also write a comparison between the Riviera GS 425 and its closest contemporaries, like the Cadillac Eldorado and Oldsmobile Tornado, to show how Buick's gentleman's dragster stood apart from other luxury performance coupes of the mid-60s.
The 1973 AMC Javelin AMX 401 is a car that many muscle enthusiasts overlook, yet it embodies a fascinating mix of speed, style, and rarity that makes it a true hidden gem of the early 70s. AMC wasn't a giant like Ford, Chevrolet, or Chrysler, and with far smaller resources, they had to make every project count. The Javelin, particularly in its AMC 401 trim, is a testament to what a smaller manufacturer could achieve when it pushed engineering and design to the limit. Unlike the more famous Mustangs and Camaros, which had massive advertising budgets and dealer networks, the Javelin relied on sheer performance, smart styling, and racing pedigree to make its mark, and while it succeeded on the streets and tracks, history often forgot it. Under the hood of the Javelin AMX 401 sat AMC's 401 cubic inch V8, an engine that balanced torque and horsepower to create a potent street machine. Rated conservatively at over 330 horsepower, in reality, many examples produced more when properly tuned. The torque curve was broad and usable, giving the car strong acceleration at both low and high RPMs, a trait that made it feel alive even in everyday driving. With a 4-barrel carburetor and optional headers, the engine could send the Javelin from 0 to 60 in roughly 6.5 seconds, a figure that rivaled much more famous muscle cars of the era. The quarter mile could be conquered in the low 14-second range, making it a legitimate drag strip contender despite AMC's smaller stature. Styling was another area where the Javelin AMX shone. Its long hood, sloped fastback roofline, and aggressive stance made it appear more expensive and exotic than its price tag suggested. The AMX trim added stripes, badging, and subtle aerodynamic cues that hinted at its performance potential without screaming for attention. On the road, it carried a presence that rivaled bigger budget competitors, turning heads at stoplights and car meets alike. Inside, the cabin offered sport-oriented bucket seats and a functional layout, proving that AMC cared about driver experience even when their budgets were tight. Performance wasn't limited to the streets. The Javelin AMX 401 also had a bona fide racing pedigree, competing in Trans Am and other road racing events. Its chassis and suspension were designed to handle the power with composure, and while it didn't have the massive aftermarket support of Chevy or Ford, its lightweight,
and balanced handling made it a capable competitor on twisty tracks. Drivers of the period frequently commented that it felt nimble for a full-size pony car, and that with some tuning, it could easily hang or beat more celebrated rivals in head-to-head racing scenarios. Part of the AMX 401's mystique comes from its rarity. AMC simply couldn't produce numbers comparable to Mustang, Camaro, or Pontiac Firebird. The limited production, combined with racing-focused owners and enthusiasts, meant that many examples were modified, raced hard, or lost over time. Today, finding an original, numbers-matching Javelin AMX 401 is increasingly difficult, which only heightens its status among collectors who understand that true performance doesn't always come with a famous badge. Owners who lived with the Javelin AMX 401 often praised its combination of speed, style, and understated presence. One recalled, "People laughed when they saw the AMC badge, but when I hit the gas, they were all looking at my taillights. It didn't matter that we weren't a big company, the car did the talking for me." Another said that its handling and torque made highway cruising exhilarating, giving the sensation of a car much more expensive than it actually was. The 1973 AMC Javelin AMX 401 is a perfect example of how ingenuity, style, and raw performance can coexist in a package that few today appreciate. It may have been a smaller manufacturer's effort overshadowed by Ford, Chevrolet, and Mopar, but it delivered muscle in a smart, effective, and thrilling way. In many ways, it's the car that proves you don't need the biggest marketing budget to create a legend. You just need a brilliant engine, sharp styling, and the courage to race.